On a windy Monday in March 2009 at 7:12 in the morning, Clayton Coleman eased his 1998 Ford F-150 into the co-op fertilizer line outside Grundy Center, and two men in clean, insulated jackets looked over, then looked away with that quick, practiced glance rural people use when they have already decided your balance sheet from your tailgate. His truck had 318,000 miles, rust along both rocker panels, one cracked mirror taped at the hinge, and baling wire twisted through the latch to keep the tailgate shut. His canvas coat was patched at both elbows. His seed cap had gone from navy to a tired gray blue. Mud sat dry on his boots from the previous week. 10 minutes later, Trent Malloy pulled in with a new diesel pickup carrying dealer plates and polished aluminum wheels, logo hat clean, jacket pressed, coffee cup in hand. Trent sold machinery for a living and confidence for free. He stood where everyone could hear him and asked Clayton, smiling for the small crowd, whether that old truck would survive one more season or finally retire itself in the ditch. People laughed because they recognized the script. New truck equals progress. Old truck equals trouble. Clayton gave him the same answer he had given variations of for years. It starts every morning. That was all. No defense, no speech. By appearance alone, Trent looked successful and Clayton looked cornered. The arithmetic said the reverse. By the spring of 2008, Clayton owned 640 acres, free and clear across Marshall County, Grundy County, and western Blackhawk County. He kept $412,000 in short-duration Treasury bills laddered in 91-day and 182-day maturities. He had paid $0 of equipment interest since 1989. His machinery line on paper looked old enough to invite pity, but every piece was owned outright. The machine people mocked most was parked in his shed on limestone screenings. An International Harvester 1086, bought from a junkyard near Eldora for $600 after a salvage storm. The hour meter was dead. Two rear lights were missing. One side panel was bent inward. Trent called it a museum donation with wheels. Clayton put in $2,480 in parts over 5 weeks, documented every receipt in a wire binder, and spent 86 labor hours rebuilding the fuel system, replacing hoses, resealing the hydraulic fittings, and rewiring enough harness to make the gauges honest again. At his own labor rate of $0, total capital cost stood at $3,080. A comparable finance tractor package Trent was pushing that month required $58,400 down, or a 7-year note at 7.4%, with a balloon clause on page 4. That gap, not personality, defined the story. Clayton had not started with a philosophy. He started with one bad lesson that never left him. In January 1985, when he was 34 and still renting most of what he worked, he attended a farm auction where a neighbor, Harold Jensen, lost 240 acres after rate resets doubled his annual debt service. Harold was not reckless. He was organized, sober, and hardworking. He financed land and machinery during years when grain looked strong, then watched operating loans reprice while corn weakened. The numbers squeezed from both sides. At the sale, Harold stood by the gate and thanked people for coming because he was that kind of man. Clayton watched his wife fold sales sheets into her coat pocket, so her hands had something to do. He drove home and wrote one sentence in a ruled notebook. Never let a lender schedule your harvest for you. He did not become extreme. He became precise. In 1986, he rented 110 acres at $72 per acre and planted corn and soybeans in rotation. Gross crop sales reached $68,900. Operating costs were $41,300. Net before family draw was $27,600. He took $16,000 home, left $11,600 in the farm account, and bought no new machinery. In 1989, after 3 years of accumulated savings and one small inheritance of $9,200 from an aunt, he paid $24,500 cash for a used John Deere 4440 with 8,900 hours and fading paint. He ran it for 14 seasons. Total repairs over that period were $18,740. Total interest paid, $0. A neighbor who purchased a newer equivalent on credit spent less on repairs and much more on finance charges. Clayton tracked both columns because comparison was his teacher. In 1996, he made the move that changed his trajectory. First 80 acres bought for $72,000 cash from an estate that wanted to clean clothes. He had $75,400 liquid at signing, paid in one transfer, and kept $3,400 in reserve. That same year, he drove the same truck to town and still got asked whether he was making it. In 2001, he added 120 acres at $1,180 per acre. Total $141,600 cash again. He had timed grain sales in 3 blocks that season, averaging $2.54 per bushel on corn, when county average realized $2.31. The extra 23 cents across 41,000 bushels produced $9,430 more gross. He did not celebrate. He rolled it into land. In 2004, he sold a small hog unit that had become labor-heavy and margin-thin, clearing $96,000 net after cleanup and taxes. People expected him to buy a late-model combine. He bought treasury bills instead and increased cash buffer targets from 6 months to 18 months of operating expense. He called it sleeping money. In 2007, he formalized a liquidity reserve at $150,000 minimum and wrote rules on an index card in his desk drawer. No equipment notes, no variable rate debt, no cross-collateral pledges, and no lease that could not be covered by conservative yield assumptions. That same year, Trent began expanding market share with 7-year packages that looked manageable in year 1 and tightened hard by year 5. Monthly payment sheets looked smooth. Page 4 did not. Clayton treated that hinge point as a governing rule because the rest of the season only made sense through it. Discipline looked slow until the year everybody needed speed. He believed one battered tractor and one boring ledger could outlast an entire financed fleet, and he had built his whole operation to prove it. By the second week of April 2008, Clayton was already doing the unglamorous work that does not photograph well and saves farms anyway. He prepaid a portion of fertilizer in the off-season when suppliers offered a discount that trimmed his nitrogen cost by $41 per ton against spring pricing. On 980 effective acres worked between owned ground and rental tracts, that adjustment alone preserved just over $11,000 in margin. He purchased seed in early commitment windows, accepted lower trait packages where pest pressure history allowed it, and saved another $18 to $26 per acre, depending on field. He changed his own oil, rebuilt his own starter motors, and replaced his own bearings unless a job required a machine shop. His household spending looked like a retired school custodian, not a man accumulating serious assets. Annual living expense ran near $28,400. Food, $6,900. Utilities, $4,200. Health premiums, $7,100. Truck fuel and maintenance, $3,800. Property tax on home place, $2,600. Clothing, $500. Church and local giving, $1,600. All other spending, $1,700. No vacation debt, no recreational loans, no concealed monthly burn. At machinery auctions, he moved like a man buying fence posts, not trophies. In the fall of 2008, he bought a used 6-row planter for $3,200 cash and hauled it home on a borrowed trailer. One marker arm was bent and one hopper lid cracked. He spent $740 correcting both, installed new chains and drive sprockets for $310, and calibrated population meters himself. Total in service cost, $4,250. A comparable finance planter package available through Trent's lot required $42,000 principal, 7.1% interest, and annual payments of roughly $7,300 before insurance riders. Clayton did not argue with people who chose differently. He knew most of them. Ben Rourke was raising 3 children and trying to keep pace on 1,400 acres. Denise Halverson had inherited difficult timing, not bad judgment. Miguel Ortega was working from rented ground with no family land cushion. Eli and Sharon Price had good soil and thin liquidity after medical bills. They were not foolish people. They were people making decisions under pressure, the same as everyone. Clayton's method simply priced pressure before it arrived. When neighbors teased him about running Junkyard iron, he nodded and tightened another fitting. At dusk, he often sat on an overturned bucket by the 1086, grease on his hands, notebook open on his knee, recording parts cost to the dollar and engine hours to the 10th when the replacement meter finally worked. The tractor looked rough under fluorescent lights, but its function was clear: paid for, field-ready, and answerable to no lender. That was the frame entering 2009. One man in patched canvas, one rebuilt machine worth less than many monthly payments, one ledger built over 23 years, and one local culture still convinced that shiny debt and real wealth were the same thing. 2 days later, the same Ford rolled into Trent Malloy's dealership lot with fresh mud on the wheel wells and a cracked left taillight that had finally gone dark. Clayton stepped out in the same patched canvas coat, carrying a legal pad and a folded custom harvest agreement that had just collapsed under lender hold. The contractor, who usually cut 420 of his acres, had called at 6:18 that morning and said his combine was parked until further notice because his bank had frozen equipment titles tied to an operating line review. Trent met Clayton at the glass door in a clean quarter zip with the dealership logo stitched over the chest and a new smartwatch catching the light. He looked prepared for a sale, not a season. The proposal was already printed. $286,000, financed at 8.1% variable, first payment deferred, cross-collateralized with Clayton's paid-off north parcel, 7 years covenant review at year 3. The monthly estimate started at $4,982, then floated with rate movement. Page 4 carried the real hinge: a collateral sweep clause if commodity prices stayed below trigger bands for 2 quarters. Clayton read all 9 pages standing up. He asked one question about the covenant trigger math, then one about prepayment penalties, then set the packet down on Trent's desk. His answer was 11 words delivered flat and calm. No note, no lien, no variable rate, and no north parcel. Trent leaned back and tried urgency. He said old iron could not carry commercial acreage through a compressed spring. That timing was now a credit problem, and that this was the last protective package he could offer before lenders tightened again. Clayton thanked him, walked out, and drove straight to his machine shed to redraw the entire season on one yellow legal sheet. By noon, he had converted a broken custom plan into a cash workflow. The 1086 would pull the used 6-row planter he had bought for $3,200 cash, now $4,250 all in after repairs and setup. A retired neighbor would run tender support at $18 per hour for planting and side dressing windows. 2 college kids home for summer would be hired for rock picking, wagon moves, and night fueling at $14.50 per hour. Paid each Friday, no deferred labor liabilities. He rented 1 additional field cultivator for 19 days at $1,900 flat and prepaid diesel for 7,200 gallons at a local contract price of $3.41 per gallon. Total $24,552, which was high but known. His revised operating budget for the 2009 crop year came in at $305,760 across roughly 980 worked acres, or $312 per acre, including rent, fuel, seed, fertilizer, labor, repairs, insurance, and drying assumptions. The county benchmark for financed operators that spring was tracking near $468 per acre before stress costs. By dusk, the legal pad held a full-season map with each task tied to cash he controlled rather than credit he did not. The plan met weather before it met opinion. The first week of May answered Trent's sales script with the weather. 10 straight rain days sat on Marshall and Grundy counties, and each morning Clayton walked field edges with a tile probe, then returned to the shed and worked through deferred maintenance tasks in order of risk: planter chain tension, seed meter brushes, hydraulic couplers, injector return lines. He tracked each part in the wire binder, not from habit alone, but because 3 landlords had requested proof he could finish on schedule without new credit. By May 11th, he mailed each landlord a 1-page operations update with machine availability, labor assignments, and projected planting completion by tract. Landlord 1, Ruth Kessler, renewed immediately for 160 acres at unchanged terms. Landlord 2, Aaron Pike, held 120 acres and asked for weekly progress calls. Landlord 3, the Whitcomb siblings, managing 200 acres from out of state, sent back a cautious note after Trent told them old machinery could not protect yield timing on commercial ground. By the 3rd week of May, when fields finally opened, Clayton ran 16 hours on the first 2 dry days and planted 76 acres, then 64, then lost half a day to mud and still stayed inside his revised calendar. The 1086 was slow compared with modern fleets, but the field passes were consistent, and the stand counts surprised people who had expected patchy emergence. At the co-op scale line, the jokes changed tone. They did not disappear, but they softened into questions about seed depth and row unit pressure. Clayton answered with numbers and went home. Around him, the debt cascade moved faster than the weather. Ben Rourke had financed $410,000 in machinery 18 months earlier, with blended terms that looked manageable at signing. His scheduled obligation jumped from $4,900 a month to $6,300 after rate resets and balloon alignment, and by July he could not cover both equipment and operating payments. The bank filed action. He lost the farm. Denise Halverson saw her operating line repriced to 10.2%, then lost a yield hedge when acreage shifted late, and the combined shortfall forced a foreclosure auction she attended in a folding chair near the back fence. Miguel Ortega absorbed 2 low-yield seasons on rented ground with no owned land buffer, then took a $92,000 equipment deficiency judgment after liquidation values came in below note balance. Eli and Sharon Price, after medical costs and weak basis bids, surrendered 320 acres to stop legal fees from draining what remained of their equity. Good people, careful people, one wrong financing cycle in a hostile market. Clayton was not insulated from that grief. Ben had once helped him pull a planter transmission in freezing wind. Denise had delivered meals to Sharon during recovery months. Miguel had repaired a broken spray boom for Clayton and refused payment beyond parts. When their numbers went red, he did not treat it as cautionary theater. He treated it as community damage. In late June, he quietly advanced $4,800 to Ben for interim housing and utility deposits, interest-free, written as a private note, payable only when stable income returned. He covered Denise's grain-drying bill shortfall of $3,260 to keep her inventory from distress sale timing. He paid Miguel $1,900 for custom spraying that Miguel needed to keep his truck insured through August. None of those sums changed his net worth trajectory. All of them changed immediate outcomes. A week later, the machine that carried everyone's assumptions broke at exactly the wrong time. The 1,086 lost hydraulic pressure during side dress application on a 94-acre tract west of Conrad, and the pump housing showed hairline fracture around a mounting ear. New replacement lead time was 9 days. 9 days in late June was calendar damage he could not absorb. He located a salvage unit in Tama County for $380, drove there that evening, pressure tested it on site, bought it cash, and returned to the shed by 10:40. Parts to adapt fittings cost another $146. He and one hired hand worked until 2:15 in the morning, slept 4 hours, and had the tractor back in the field at 7:30. Total outage, 13 hours. Estimated yield protection from avoided nitrogen delay based on his prior field history and county extension response curves was between $19 and $34 per acre on the affected block. Even the low estimate made the repair decision obvious. Then came the ledger line that explained why he could keep deciding from strength while others were deciding from fear. He kept it in a ruled notebook and read it to no one unless asked directly. 1996, first 80 acres, $72,000 cash. 1999, machine reserve opened, $22,400. 2001 added 120 acres at $1,180 per acre, $141,600 cash. 2004, hog units sold, $96,000 net moved to liquidity. 2006, Treasury ladder established, target 6 months operating expense. 2007, reserve floor raised to $150,000. 2008, prepaid fertilizer discount captured. Input cost reduced by $11,000 plus. 2008, seed commitments timed. $18 to $26 per acre savings across selected tracts. 2009, crisis entry point, zero machinery debt, $412,000 in short duration bills, no collateral pledges on equipment. It looked plain on paper. It felt radical in practice. He closed the notebook and went back to uptime decisions, because the argument in 2009 was settled in hours available per field window, not in showroom language. By mid-July, county gossip had shifted from ridicule to uneasy curiosity, because Clayton finished second cultivation on schedule and several financed operations did not. Repossessions had delayed planters, then delayed replant decisions, and uniformity suffered where windows closed. Clayton's fields were not perfect, but they were timely. Timely beats shiny when weather compresses. That same week, he attended a lender liquidation auction outside Conrad and bought a repossessed grain cart for $5,400 cash. People assumed he was expanding. He was triaging. He spent $620 on tires and one auger patch, put the cart in service, and started custom hauling for displaced neighbors at cost. 14 cents per bushel handling with fuel billed at posted pump rate, no markup. Commercial alternatives were quoting 22 cents to 28 cents with the wait times. On Denise's acres alone, that differential preserved roughly $6,800 in crop value by reducing moisture penalties and shrink from delayed movement. On Miguel's rented tracts, faster haul windows prevented one basis hit that would have cost him another 11 cents per bushel on 24,000 bushels. Small numbers per line, life-changing totals by season end. 3 days after he started hauling, Aaron Pike called back about his 120 rented acres and renewed without adjustment after reviewing field logs and harvest capacity notes. The Whitcomb siblings waited until the first week of August, then extended 1 year with a contingency clause tied to completion percentages that Clayton accepted because he had the machinery discipline to satisfy it. Trent kept making calls, still arguing that older equipment could not scale, but his own floor plan lender had already begun tightening new inventory approvals, and 2 units on his lot were under hold tags by month end. Clayton did not celebrate any of that. He checked bearings, greased joints, wrote fuel gallons in the binder, and paid labor every Friday in envelopes marked by initials and hours. The patched coat remained patched. The Ford remained rusted. The tailgate still closed with baling wire. From the road, he looked one breakdown from failure. In the ledger, he was building optionality while the market removed it from almost everyone else. The same evening, with the shop light still on and diesel smell hanging in the rafters, Clayton carried the wire binder and 3 older ledger books into his kitchen and laid them beside a yellow legal pad. He was not preparing a speech. He was preparing proof. The Whitcomb siblings had asked for completion percentages by tract, and Aaron Pike wanted one more review before harvest. In markets like 2009, confidence had to be converted into arithmetic. He started with the oldest notebook, the one with the curled black cover from the late 1980s, and rebuilt the story line by line. In 1986, he retained $11,600 after family draw. In 1987, he retained $12,040. In 1988, after a wetter spring and lower basis, he retained only $8,900, but he still closed the year with $32,540 in cash and no machinery note. In 1989, he paid $24,500 cash for the used John Deere 4440 and ended December with $14,880 liquid, thin but stable. In 1990, he rebuilt liquidity to $29,300. In 1991, he reached $44,200. In 1992, after a strong soybean year, he finished at $63,100. Then came the first decision that looked cautious and proved aggressive. In 1993, he passed on a finance planner package at 8.3% and bought a repaired used unit for $5,800 cash. The financed package would have required $1,020 per month for 60 months. Total payout, $61,200, including fees. His used planter, plus repairs over 6 years, cost $11,460. Difference, $49,740. He moved that difference into land savings. In 1994, retained earnings added $18,200. In 1995, he added $16,900 and closed with $75,400 cash. the exact number that allowed the estate purchase in 1996. 80 acres at $72,000. Closing costs and recording fees, $2,180. Remaining cash after close, $1,220 in checking, and $2,180 in a short certificate, exactly as his note showed. He had been asked for years why he looked behind. The answer sat in one line. Cash ownership had outrun appearances. He paused long enough to square the pages, then kept writing, because the next set of entries was the part most people never saw when they judged him by the truck in his driveway. The pattern had never depended on one lucky year. It depended on repeating the same discipline when nobody was watching. He turned the page and kept stacking years. In 1997 and 1998, retained earnings averaged $21,600, and he directed $32,000 total into a tax-exempt municipal ladder yielding between 4.1 and 4.6%. In 1999, he opened what he called the Machine Reserve, with $22,400, separate from household cash, separate from land savings, untouchable except for repairs or equipment bought outright. In 2000, despite weaker corn, he retained $19,300 and increased reserve balances to $58,700 across cash and short paper. The 2001 land purchase followed, 120 acres at $1,180 per acre, 100 at $41,600 cash. Title work, transfer tax, and legal fees added $3,940. Total cash outflow $145,540. He did it by liquidating $97,000 in municipals using $38,540 from cash reserve and preserving $12,000 for operations. No bank lien, no adjustable clause, no page 4 surprises. From 2002 through 2004, he pushed hard on margin discipline. Diesel hedges through fixed pre-buy contracts saved 19 cents to 27 cents per gallon in high weeks. Fertilizer timing saved another $8,400 over 3 seasons. In 2004, he sold the hog unit, net $96,000 after cleanup and taxes, and split it deliberately. $60,000 to Treasury bills, $20,000 to machine reserve, $16,000 to contingency cash. By the end of 2005, his liquid position was $214,300 and rising. He wrote one number in the margin and circled it twice. Interest avoided. If he had mirrored the county trend between 1993 and 2008, he estimated he would have carried average equipment debt of roughly $210,000 at blended rates near 6.9%. Over 15 years, even with periodic paydown, expected interest cost would have been about $137,000. His actual equipment interest paid over that span, $0. That $137,000, compounded through land and short paper, had become options when options mattered. By late August, when leaves were starting to show edge curl on lighter ground, he had the whole sequence condensed to a 2-page statement for landlords. It listed owned acres, 640, all debt-free. Treasury bills and cash equivalents, $400 to $12,000. Municipal holdings, $188,000. Grain inventory at conservative valuation, $274,000. Total estimated asset base before 2009 harvest upside, $6,974,000 against liabilities limited to routine payables under 30 days. Net worth estimate, $6,835,000. He stapled field completion logs behind it and mailed copies the next morning. The contrast with his peers had never been about intelligence. It was about sequence risk. Ben Rourke had expanded when land rents and machinery costs were climbing in tandem, because standing still looked like decline in those years. His 2007 and 2008 purchases totaled $410,000, financed across layered notes, one fixed at 6.8% for 60 months, one variable starting at 7.2% with reset language tied to lender cost of funds, and one lease buyout with a balloon in year 5. When basis widened and yield slipped, his monthly burden moved from $4,900 to $6,300. Then late penalties pushed it higher. By the time he listed equipment for private sale, forced market values were already down 18 to 24% from his purchase prices. He did not lose his farm because he was careless. He lost it because timing punished leverage. Denise Halverson's path was equally rational at the start. She inherited operational responsibility, not a cash cushion, and used a revolving operating line to bridge seed, fertilizer, and fuel. In 2008, that line renewed at 7.1%. In 2009, it reset at 10.2% with tighter collateral calls. Her average outstanding balance during input season was $287,000. The rate jump alone added roughly $8,900 annualized interest. Then delayed planning cut yield potential on her weakest quarter, and a hedge mismatch cost another $21,400 when delivery timing shifted. She attended her own foreclosure auction in a folding chair because there was no other way to keep track of what sold and for how much. Clayton never described that day as a lesson. He described it as a wound in plain view. Miguel Ortega had no inherited acreage and no family capital behind him, only rented tracts and long workdays. He financed equipment on the assumption that 2 average years would stabilize cash flow. Instead, he got 2 subpar years, a basis hit, and repair overruns. After liquidation, he faced a $92,000 deficiency judgment that did not disappear just because the machinery was gone. He moved from owner-operator to contract spraying to stay in agriculture. Pride bent, but did not break. Eli and Sharon Price carried 320 acres with solid productivity and decades of labor in the soil, then got squeezed by medical expenses and legal fees during refinancing negotiations. Their lender proposed terms that preserved collateral, not household continuity. They surrendered acreage to stop costs from compounding. In another market cycle, they might have bridged through. In this one, legal timing outran field timing. Clayton saw each case up close while hauling grain at cost. He did not give advice from a distance. He watched invoices being sorted on kitchen counters and listened to people calculate which bill could wait 10 more days. On one route, he hauled 18,600 bushels for Denise over a 12-day stretch at 14 cents per bushel handling, total $2,604, plus exact fuel pass-through. Commercial hauling at 24 cents would have cost $4,464. Difference preserved, $1,860, enough to cover one insurance installment she had been postponing. For Miguel, he moved 24,000 bushels on the same terms, preserving $2,400 in direct handling costs and another $2,640 by beating a basis downgrade. Those numbers did not reverse old debt, but they prevented new damage. He kept those savings lines in the same ledger as his own costs, not to make a point, but to measure whether the hauling work was still buying neighbors enough time to matter. By then, the season itself was answering the question that coffee shop talk had argued all spring. Appearance could borrow confidence for a while, but only survival math carried a farm through September. The broader crisis tightened in September. Grain prices stayed weak, and 2 regional ethanol plants cut bids as margins compressed, widening local basis by 31 cents to 37 cents on several delivery windows. Diesel, after summer spikes, did not return to levels producers had budgeted in winter. More important, credit committees moved from growth language to protection language. Renewal packets that once took 2 signatures now came back with collateral schedules, stress tests, and covenant addenda. Several operators who expected routine rollover found themselves asked for additional security or partial principal reduction before spring. Policy pressure added another layer. County assessors, working from prior sales, had lifted taxable valuations on some tracts, even as commodity prices retraced, so cash obligations rose while revenue assumptions fell. Crop insurance remained a buffer, but not a cure, because indemnities arrived after bills were due and did not cover every basis and timing penalty. Farms with heavy fixed payments needed smooth months. 2009 delivered jagged ones. Clayton's operating map absorbed the shocks because he had removed the most dangerous fixed payment in advance, machinery debt service. His per-acre operating cost was tracking at $312, including rent and hired labor. Comparable financed operations in his area were running near $468 before extraordinary repairs and penalty interest. On 980 acres, that $156 spread represented $152,880 in seasonal breathing room. In a high-margin year, it would look like prudence. In 2009, it looked like oxygen. He still faced risk. A single major failure at the wrong hour could erase a week. A 6-row planter cannot become a 12-row planter by optimism. He managed that constraint with schedule, discipline, and redundancy in people, not in chrome. He kept one retired mechanic on call at $40 per hour for emergency evening work. He staged common failure parts in labeled bins: belts, hydraulic hoses, filters, bearings, couplers, and electrical ends, $3,740 in inventory that eliminated multi-day waits. He fueled and greased by checklist, not mood. He logged downtime by cause and adjusted shifts by field distance. It was not glamorous. It was robust. 3 days into September, Aaron Pike called after reviewing his mailed statement and said only, "You finish what you start." The call reaffirmed that the 120 acres he had already renewed would stand at existing terms for the following season. The Whitcomb siblings sent written confirmation a week later for their 200 acres, contingency language removed after field inspections. Ruth Kessler had already renewed. Lease stability alone protected roughly $184,000 in expected gross margin that would have disappeared if acreage had been pulled. Trent Malloy kept driving county roads, still arguing that old iron could not sustain commercial pace, but his own constraints were becoming visible. Floor plan checks slowed. 2 transport deliveries were postponed. 1 salesman left for a parts distributor in Cedar Falls. Trent was not a cartoon villain. He was a man trained in a growth paradigm that depended on expanding credit, now working in a season where credit itself had become the missing part. Clayton did what he had done all year. He stayed at the edge of each field until the pass was done, then moved to the next tract with the same dented tractor, the same patched coat, and the same ledger discipline that looked small until markets turned large. By the second week of September, the county had stopped laughing and started calculating. And calculating in that county always led to a sale barn, a bank desk, or an auction ring, where numbers stopped being private. With corn moisture still high and a frost advisory posted for the coming weekend, Clayton pulled into the foreclosure lot outside Conrad just after noon, left the 1086 idling on the trailer, and walked toward the clerk table with oil on his gloves. The auction list that day carried 3 repossessed tractors, 2 late-model combines, 4 grain heads, a 12-row planter, and a 240-acre parcel bordering Clayton's east boundary, ground Trent had once described as finance-grade expansion acreage. The field crowd expected lenders, investors, and at least one large operator from Story County. They did not expect Clayton to bid past opening round chatter. Trent stood near the portable speaker rack in pressed denim and dealership fleece, still performing certainty because that was the only posture he had left. He told one bystander that credit would loosen by spring. He told another that this was a temporary overcorrection. Then he saw Clayton take a bidder card and went quiet for the first time all season. Bidding on the land opened at $1,750 per acre and climbed in uneven jumps. $1,900, $2,000, $2,025. A lender representative dropped out at $2,030. An investor group held to $2,030.50. Clayton answered at $2,031.25 and did not move again until the final call. At $2,029, there had been noise. At $2,031.25, there was mostly wind and shoes on gravel. The hammer fell on Clayton's call, and the clerk then read the settlement conversion. The accepted gross bid of $2,031.25 became $2,029.17 net per deeded acre after mapped easement deduction, preserving the $487,000 total contract value with fees. The clerk asked for financing terms. Clayton handed over a certified check drawn that morning from maturing Treasury bills and cash reserve sweep accounts. Full amount, no contingencies, no delayed funding language. The clerk checked the watermark, then looked up twice, as if the name and the truck in the lot did not fit the paper in his hand. Trent asked carefully whether the check would clear same day. The bank officer at the table dialed in, read the instrument number, listened, and said into open air, "Funds verified and settled." No one laughed. No one clapped. The revelation happened the way most true revelations happen, in farming communities, without theater, with people doing mental subtraction in real time. That afternoon, while Trent was still fielding calls about stalled floor plan approvals, Clayton went back to harvest rotation and cut until dark. He had bought 240 acres cash in the middle of a credit seizure, and still made the evening pass. The real question, riding in those combines and grain carts, was no longer who looked modern in the lot. It was whether, under pressure, a producer chose borrowed speed or slower ownership that preserved options in bad years. That question sat over every field in Marshall and Grundy that fall, whether people said it out loud or not. As the frost window tightened to 6 workable days, Clayton shifted from personal survival math to community triage with deliberate structure. He kept hauling at cost, but he also began writing targeted checks where one timely amount could prevent cascading loss. Ben Rourke had already lost title, yet his family needed stability before any restart was possible. Clayton converted the earlier $4,800 bridge into a formal zero-interest note and added $11,200 for relocation, equipment storage, and winter utility continuity. Total support, $16,000. Repayment deferred 18 months with no penalties. Ben cried once in the machine shed, then signed and went back to loading bins for contract wages because pride still mattered. For Denise Halverson, Clayton did not offer a speech or pity. He sat at her kitchen table with 3 invoices, 1 insurance notice, and her projected spring input sheet. He paid the remaining 2009 drying and storage shortfall of $3,260 as he had promised, then extended a $27,500 seasonal note at 0 interest to replace high-cost operating credit that had been pricing her out of planning decisions. Terms were plain. Principal due after harvest, 2010 if cash flow allowed, otherwise rollover for 1 year, no compounding. With that bridge, she kept her rented 140 acres, planted on time, and avoided another distressed sale cycle. Miguel Ortega received the largest early intervention because his deficiency judgment had boxed him out of ordinary vendor terms. Clayton wired $36,000 directly to a dealer in Waterloo for a used self-propelled spray rig Miguel had inspected twice, then added $4,000 working cash for licensing, insurance, and initial chemical inventory. Total package $40,000, 0 interest, 48-month payback schedule, tied to billed acres rather than fixed monthly burden. Miguel moved from irregular contract work to owning his own route by the following June, and his first season, net after expenses, reached $22,700, enough to make every scheduled payment and still rebuild personal reserves. Eli and Sharon Price needed a different tool. They had surrendered 320 acres to stop legal costs, but their home place and adjacent 80 acres could still be preserved with patient terms. Clayton negotiated with the current holder, purchased that 80-acre tract at $2,140 per acre, total $171,200, and immediately seller financed it back to the prices at 3.0%, simple interest across 20 years, no balloon, annual payment $11,116. Their prior refinancing proposal had carried variable terms that could have exceeded $18,000 in weak years. The lower fixed burden kept them in their house and on land they understood by memory, not by map. Those were individual rescues. Clayton then built infrastructure so rescue would not depend on his mood or his phone. What follows sits outside that continuous fall run, but it matters because the mechanism was designed to persist after the immediate crisis. After bins were sealed and fieldwork ended, he met with counsel in Marshalltown and funded the Coleman Working Capital Fund at $1,400,000. Capital allocation was conservative by design, $1 million in short municipal and Treasury ladder instruments, yielding between 2.1 and 3.4%, generating baseline income for administrative continuity, and $400,000 reserved for revolving zero-interest seasonal notes capped at $40,000 each. 12 recipients were selected in the first cycle from operators who had viable agronomy and weak financing options, including Carter Rourke, Ben's son, and Leah Halverson, Denise's daughter. Every note carried one condition and one only. Within 3 years, each borrower had to mentor another producer for at least 1 full season and document meetings, budgets, and field decisions. Carter took $38,000 to secure a used combine header and replace a failed unloading auger on an older machine he could actually maintain. Leah took $34,000 for seed, fertilizer, and rent deposits on 210 acres she could not have planted under commercial line terms. Miguel, though older than most in the cohort, took a second structured note of $18,000 for expansion, nozzles, and tender trailer upgrades after he met first-year repayment benchmarks. 2 livestock operators took $22,000 and $26,000 respectively to refinance feed inventory at 0 interest rather than 9+% revolving debt. 4 grain operators drew between $29,000 and $40,000 for operating windows that banks had either declined or priced punitively. Funds moved by invoice verification, not by handshake alone, because Clayton wanted discipline to outlive personality. The emphasis was mechanism, not mythology. He did not save people by being generous in the abstract. He changed the cost of time. 0 interest on the right $30,000 can be the difference between 1 season of recovery and 5 years of decline. At a renewal meeting, Clayton did not need but attended anyway, partly for records and partly because paperwork closes arguments that gossip opens. The statement packet showed 880 owned acres after the Conrad purchase, estimated at blended market value $6,952,000 using conservative, comparable sales. Grain inventory was marked at $612,000 after storage and moisture adjustments. Municipal and Treasury holdings stood at $1,018,000 after the $1.4 million fund transfer and post-harvest reallocations. Cash on hand was $294,000. Machinery book value, intentionally understated, was $126,000. Total assets, $9,002,000. Total liabilities, mostly routine payables and accrued property tax, were $402,000. Net worth estimate, $8,600,000. The operating side was just as clear. On 980 worked acres in 2009, Clayton closed at $312 per acre, all in, including rent and hired labor. County finance peer average using extension and lender anonymized aggregates was $468 per acre before extraordinary penalty costs. Spread, $156 per acre, or $152,880 preserved margin. His net cash margin after land rent and all seasonal expenses landed at $226,000 in one of the worst credit years in decades. Had he accepted Trent's $286,000 variable package at 8.1%, first-year carrying cost including interest, insurance riders, and required reserve covenants, would have added roughly $41,000 to $47,000 cash burden, with cross-collateral risk on his north parcel, if price triggers missed. That risk never touched him because he never signed page 4. The fund arithmetic then started proving itself in sequence. In year 1, 12 notes issued. Total disbursed $392,000. Delinquency 0 at year end, though 2 were extended by crop timing clauses. In year 2, repayments and reissues brought cumulative assistance to $648,000 across 14 producers. In year 3, the mentorship condition produced 11 documented pairings and 2 additional startups. By year 5, 10 of the original 12 remained solvent and active, collectively farming 3,260 acres with combined estimated land control value above $16 million. Carter Rourke had paid his first note in full and was mentoring a beginning operator on 90 rented acres. Leah Halverson had reduced high-cost operating exposure by more than half and moved into partial ownership of equipment she had once rented by the hour. Miguel cleared both notes in 4 years, then bought his spray rig outright and hired 1 employee at full season wages. The multiplier was not sentimental, it was measurable. Clayton's initial $1,400,000 commitment, managed with rotating repayment and conservative reserve yield, supported $2,430,000 in total seasonal lending over 5 years while maintaining principal integrity. That lending, in turn, stabilized or restarted operations touching 3,260 acres, preserving local custom work, input purchases, and household spending that would otherwise have left the counties as liquidation loss. Debt had promised scale through leverage. Clayton produced scale through liquidity and patience, and the numbers held under audit. At the end of that meeting, the loan officer closed the folder and said, "You are the only client this quarter who brought more assets than requests." Clayton nodded, took his copy, and drove home in the same rusted Ford with baling wire on the tailgate. Because appearance had never been the operating system, arithmetic was. That evening, after he parked the Ford beside the machine shed and set the renewal folder on the kitchen table, Clayton opened a second binder and began entering recipient schedules in the same block handwriting he used for fuel logs. He posted due dates, grace windows, crop insurance milestones, and one line in red ink beside each file. Mentorship verification required before renewal. The structure was strict because his aim was not rescue theater. His aim was continuity. By late January 2010, the first winter statements from the Coleman Working Capital Fund were out, and each borrower sat down with him or with counsel in Marshalltown to review field plans against the cash flow, not against optimism. Carter Rourke used his $38,000 note exactly as filed, $21,400 for the used header, $8,600 for auger and unloading system repair, $5,200 for preseason parts inventory, and $2,800 held as contingency. He entered spring with no equipment interest burden and closed his first full season with a positive cash margin of $43,700 on rented and share-cropped ground. He made a principal payment of $9,500 in December, then another $6,000 after March grain delivery. Leah Halverson drew $34,000 and treated it as working capital rather than spending authority. She prepaid fertilizer in 2 tranches, captured an average discount of $34 per ton, and reduced emergency in-season purchases that had been costing her 9 to 14% more in prior years. On 210 acres, her operating expense dropped from $441 per acre in 2009 to $357 in 2010, even with fuel still volatile. She repaid $11,000 in year 1, then refinanced nothing, because the point was to step away from revolving credit traps rather than decorate them. Miguel Ortega's expanded spraying route reached 24,800 billed acres by his second full year under structured notes, with gross receipts of $191,600 and net after labor, fuel, chemical handling, insurance, and depreciation of $61,300. He paid both obligations ahead of schedule, 4 years total as projected, and then converted one seasonal subcontractor role into a permanent position with health coverage. That one payroll line mattered in a county where many jobs had turned seasonal and uncertain. Eli and Sharon Price made every annual payment on the 80-acre seller finance tract. At 3.0% simple interest and $11,116 per year, their debt service stayed predictable enough to plan around weather instead of legal notices. In year 6, they made an extra principal reduction of $18,000 after a strong soybean window. The prior variable proposal they had been offered before Clayton intervened would have floated toward $18,000 in weak years and likely forced another surrender. Fixed terms changed the direction of their lives. Ben Rourke did not return to owning a large farm immediately, and that mattered to the moral honesty of the story. He worked 3 years in custom grain handling and equipment transport, paid down personal liabilities, and rebuilt credit slowly. Clayton's $16,000 bridge note had no interest and no penalties, and Ben repaid it in 4 installments over 30 months. By 2014, he was leasing 160 acres with conservative machinery needs and no long note exposure. Smaller operation, stable operation. Dignity restored without applause. The multiplier became visible by the 5th season. 10 of the original 12 fund recipients remained solvent. 2 exited agriculture voluntarily after transparent reviews, sold equipment without forced liquidation, and moved into off-farm work with their households intact. The fund had issued $2,400,000 to $30,000 in cumulative zero-interest seasonal notes while preserving principal integrity, and recipient operations collectively controlled 3,260 acres with estimated land value above $16 million. The arithmetic kept proving the same thesis through different households: reduce fixed financing pressure, preserve timing flexibility, protect family continuity. Let me stop here and ask you something. When pressure rises, do you measure strength by what looks modern in the yard, or by how many bad months your numbers can absorb? That question sat over every renewal meeting in those counties for years, and it remains a hard question because appearance answers faster than arithmetic. Trent Malloy's resolution came without public drama, and that fit the man. Through 2010 and 2011, he kept the dealership open on shrinking inventory, tighter floor plan controls, and fewer approved buyers. He was still skilled at reading personalities and still convinced at first that the downturn would reverse quickly enough to vindicate leveraged expansion. It did not. In 2012, after 2 more cycles of delayed orders and lender restrictions, he closed the new equipment operation. Employees were paid through final month. Parts inventory was liquidated in orderly sales. He was not ruined, but he was reset. By 2014, he reappeared in a different role as a used equipment broker, matching older machines to operators who cared more about serviceability than showroom gloss. The shift was pragmatic and, over time, humbling. He began to inspect maintenance records before paint. He started asking borrowers what their liquidity buffer looked like before discussing horsepower. At a county board agriculture panel in 2017, with roughly 80 people in attendance, he said one sentence that settled years of roadside argument. When markets turn, paid-for tools and patience outlast polished debt. He did not perform repentance beyond that line. He did not need to. His business model had already changed. Clayton never used Trent's reversal as a trophy. When younger producers mentioned the old dealership days, Clayton answered with 4 words. He adapted. That matters. The restraint was not politeness alone. It was principle. He had watched too many good families take damage under one bad financing cycle to treat anyone's setback as a stage prop. If you are learning something from this story, pass it to someone who is making a machinery decision this month, because the decision feels small on signing day and very large in year 3. By the second week of October 2018, 9 years after the spring when everyone had counted him out, the roll call across Marshall, Grundy, and Western Blackhawk had become unusually clear. Ruth Kessler, then in her 70s, still leased her 160 acres under stable terms and said Clayton's mailed logs were the first farm documents she ever received that read like engineering instead of promises. Aaron Pike kept his 120-acre lease relationship with Clayton until retiring from active management. His daughter took over oversight and renewed on nearly identical conditions. The Whitcomb siblings, once skeptical from out of state, retained their 200-acre arrangement, and removed all contingency language after repeated on-time completion. Carter Rourke now operated a disciplined mixed acreage model with no machinery interest exposure, mentoring 2 younger tenants through the fund requirement he once met reluctantly and later embraced fully. Leah Halverson expanded from 210 to 340 acres over several seasons, purchasing select equipment only after cash accumulation thresholds were met. She and Denise worked side by side on planning days, and Denise, who had once watched her own foreclosure auction from a folding chair, now managed records for a smaller but stable operation that did not depend on punitive credit terms. Miguel Ortega, with his spray rig paid off, added precision application services and employed 2 full-time staff by 2021, then funded vocational training for 1 technician from his own retained earnings. Eli and Sharon Price kept their home place in that critical 80-acre tract, completed roof and tile repairs they had postponed for years, and hosted family harvest meals again without letters from attorneys stacked near the salt shaker. Harold Jensen, whose 1985 auction had marked Clayton permanently, had passed years earlier, but his family received something quiet and exact from Clayton in 2016. A packet of copied ledger pages and a note that read, "His day at the gate taught me what to protect." The Jensen grandchildren framed that note in their hallway. It was not money. It was acknowledgement. As for Clayton, he kept farming with the same operational grammar. He rotated responsibilities, delegated more hauling as age pressed his knees, and shifted increasingly toward oversight, repair triage, and capital allocation. The 1998 Ford remained in service far beyond what bystanders considered reasonable, eventually crossing 402,000 miles with rust still advancing and the tailgate still secured by wire and stubbornness. The International Harvester 1086 stayed field-ready through careful off-season maintenance, then took a reduced workload in later years when he added another used unit bought outright. He refused ceremonial retirement for machines that still worked. He simply reassigned them. At a winter review in early 2023, the Coleman Working Capital Fund showed cumulative lending above $4 million since inception, with default rates below regional small farm credit averages and mentorship compliance still enforced. Clayton's own annual living expense, adjusted for inflation and health costs, remained modest relative to asset base. He owned no fleet of polished equipment. He carried no machinery note. He still evaluated purchases by one test. Does this preserve options in a bad year? The counties changed around him, as counties do. Some farms consolidated. Some sold to absentee ownership. Some children returned. Others did not. Yet the philosophy he had practiced in patched canvas and grease-stained gloves stayed legible because it was never abstract. It was entries on paper, checks that cleared, and households that remained intact. Now, if you want more stories where plain arithmetic outruns polished appearances, subscribe and stay with this channel. If this one hit close to home, comment with the hardest financial trade-off you have seen a farm family face between growth and stability, and share this with one person who thinks the newest machine in the lot always belongs to the wealthiest operator. On a cold morning not long after that 2023 review, Clayton stepped into the shed before sunrise, ran his hand along the 1086 fender, where the paint had thinned to dull red, and checked the same fittings he had checked for years. Outside, the old Ford waited by the door, rust visible even in low light. Inside, the ledgers sat stacked on a shelf above the workbench, each year dated, each number accountable. From the road, a stranger could still mistake the place for struggle. On paper, in fields, and in the lives that had stabilized because one man chose liquidity over display, the truth remained exactly what it had always been. The poorest-looking farmer in line had been the wealthiest all along. 3 days after that cold morning in the shed, Clayton drove to the Marshalltown community room with the second binder on the passenger seat and the old wire binder on the floorboard, both wrapped in a feed sack to keep road salt off the covers. The Coleman Working Capital Fund held its annual borrower review on the first Thursday of February, and by 8:10 the long table was lined with ledgers, coffee rings, and tax printouts. Carter Rourke sat at the near end with 2 folders and a penciled acreage map. Leah Halverson had a calculator, 3 invoices, and her mentorship log already tabbed. Miguel Ortega came in last, still wearing spray gloves tucked in his coat pocket out of habit, and set down a balance sheet printed on both sides to save paper. Clayton did not open with a speech. He opened the binder and read the numbers in order. Fund Inception Capital, $1,400,000. Cumulative zero-interest notes issued through year 14, $4,186,000. Principal repaid, $3,902,000. Principal outstanding current and performing, $284,000. Charge-offs, $0. Administrative cost ratio, 1.8% annually, held low by volunteer review hours and invoice-verified disbursement. Then he looked up and nodded to Carter. Carter stood and gave his report in 12 sentences. He now controlled 520 acres across lease and crop share, carried no machinery note, and held $118,400 in operating liquidity before spring planting. His 5-year average operating cost was $338 per acre versus a county trend near $452 for similarly sized financed grain operators. He had completed mentorship with 2 beginning producers as required, then kept going with a third who had no family land and no cosigner. The rule looked strict, he said, until I needed it. Leah's pages were tighter and even more revealing. She and Denise had stabilized at 340 acres, with equipment ownership phased by cash threshold, not by dealer calendar. In the prior season, their fertilizer pre-buy strategy saved $12,740 against in-season price spikes, and fuel contracts saved another $6,110. They held 0 revolving high-interest operating debt for the first time since Denise took over management years earlier. Leah slid 1 sheet across to Clayton. Mentorship verification for a young tenant on 96 acres, with monthly budget meetings logged, planting decisions documented, and 1 note in the margin that said, "No variable clause accepted." Miguel's outcome had the cleanest arithmetic arc. His custom spraying business billed 41,300 acres the previous year, grossed $412,800, and netted $97,400 after wages, insurance, fuel, maintenance, and depreciation. He owned his main rig free and clear, carried 1 modest fixed-rate note on a tender truck that would be gone in 18 months, and had built a $64,000 cash buffer for weather interruptions. He had hired the seasonal worker he once could not guarantee into a year-round position with health coverage and retirement match. "I used to borrow time," he said quietly. "Now I buy parts before they fail." By the second week of March, the Fund Committee completed renewals for 10 active producers and approved 2 new notes only after mentorship slots were matched, keeping the chain intact instead of widening it carelessly. The multiplier remained measurable, not sentimental. The current recipient network touched 3,840 acres, supported 27 full-time and seasonal jobs, and had reduced aggregate interest expense by an estimated $1,120,000 compared with equivalent commercial short-term credit over the same period. That same month, Clayton made one stop he had postponed for years. He drove to Trent Malloy's used equipment yard outside Cedar Falls, parked the rusted Ford beside a line of older tractors with handwritten service tags, and walked into a small office where the desk had more maintenance records than glossy brochures. Trent was older, slower with his words, and no longer dressed like a showroom promise. He wore work boots with actual field mud on them. He pulled a manila folder from a drawer and set it on the desk between them. Inside were photocopies of old contracts. Page 4 clauses highlighted in yellow from the years when he sold urgency as a product. "I keep these to train staff now," Trent said. "No hidden balloons. No cross-collateral language unless the customer asks for it and understands it line by line." He had rebuilt his business on brokerage fees and inspection discipline, not lender kickers. His current inventory turned slower, but defaulted less. He no longer earned his margin by pushing people into payment structures that looked gentle for 12 months and punishing by year 3. He met Clayton's eyes and finished what he had started at the 2017 panel. "I was not evil. I was wrong in a costly way," Clayton answered with the same restraint he had carried through every season. "You changed. Keep doing that." They shook hands once. No audience, no scorekeeping. The antagonism that had framed 2009 ended as two men acknowledging what markets had already proved. In late April, with planters staged and tile lines running clear, the remaining old threads closed one by one. Clayton replaced the Ford's dead left taillight lens that had been cracked since the dealership visit in 2009, logged the part number in the wire binder, and finally removed the temporary tape from the mirror hinge with a proper bracket repair. The baling wires still held the tailgate because it still worked and because he saw no virtue in replacing functional steel for appearances. He moved the 3 original black cover ledgers, the yellow legal sheet from the day he declined Trent's package, and the annotated landlord mailers into fireproof archive boxes and delivered copies to the fund office so recipient training would rest on records, not memory. The physical evidence that had carried the philosophy was now indexed, scanned, and usable for the next generation. Ruth Kessler passed peacefully that summer at 81, and her family kept the 160-acre lease relationship under the same completion standards she trusted. Aaron Pike retired from active oversight exactly as planned, and his daughter renewed the 120 acres after reviewing the same field logs her father once demanded by phone. The Whitcomb siblings, who had first written cautious notes from out of state after Trent's warning years earlier, visited in person for the first time in a decade, walked the headlands with Clayton and Leah, and signed a 5-year lease without contingency language. They admitted plainly that the uneasy look they had given him in 2009 came from fear, not contempt. They had believed the loudest voice in the room and nearly pulled acreage from the only operator who could finish it. Ben Rourke did not become the largest farmer he once imagined, and he no longer measured worth that way. He and Carter now operated adjacent schedules, shared labor during weather windows, and kept separate books by design to avoid hidden strain. Ben's bridge note had been repaid long ago, but at the 2024 review, he brought one final envelope anyway, a voluntary contribution of $4,000 to the fund mentorship travel pool, marked for the next kid with no cushion. Denise worked part-time on her own acres and part-time as the fund's records coordinator, where her memory of foreclosure paperwork made her exacting about every clause. Eli and Sharon Price were 12 payments into the seller finance structure, current and smiling more. They hosted a harvest supper that fall and set a place for Miguel, who arrived late from a spray run and stayed until dishes were done. On the first Monday of November 2025 at 7:09 in the morning, the same co-op line outside Grundy Center filled with trucks under a hard north wind. Clayton pulled in with 431,000 miles on the Ford, patched coat still patched, cap still faded. Behind him sat Carter in a 10-year-old pickup with primer on one door. 2 spots back, Leah waited with a trailer carrying a used auger bought outright. A younger operator in a spotless jacket glanced once at Clayton's tailgate wire and then, quietly, did not laugh. The county had learned the arithmetic. Clayton finished unloading, signed the ticket, and drove back toward the shed where the International Harvester 1086 still started on the first turn, when temperatures stayed above 10 degrees, and on the second turn, when they did not. It no longer carried the heaviest acres, but it still ran auger duty, still pulled wagons when needed, and still answered to the same maintenance routine that had carried 2009. The machine was not a relic, it was a record. That afternoon, he stood at the workbench, wrote one more entry in the current ledger, and shelved it beside the others in date order. Outside, rust showed on the truck. Inside, assets were paid for. Notes were current, and families once pushed to the edge were operating again on terms they could survive. Appearance had offered a quick verdict years earlier and got it wrong. Discipline wrote a slower verdict and got it right. The poorest-looking farmer in line had not won by luck, personality, or timing alone. He won by refusing to let debt make decisions for him, then using that freedom to make sure other people could keep farming too.